What I'm going to talk around is policing a mixed community from a rural force point of view, and then I'm going to hand over to Gary to talk about an urban side and talk about an area from the Met. And it's important to recognise that one size doesn't fit all, so just because I'm talking about a rural force or a rural town, it's going to be different everywhere, and the demographics of each individual town and each different issue is going to be different for us all. I'll just move forward. Oh, not working on that. Okay, I'm working now. All right, so by the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk through my journey, talk through some of the challenges for the force, for me as an area commander and for my teams, and try and explain why I've called it Nowhere to Hide. Okay, so this is Boston. Oh, great, you're with me. No, it's not Boston, Lincolnshire, it's Boston, Massachusetts. But interestingly enough, named after Boston, and Boston has got some historical significance, which we're proud of in Lincolnshire. That's more like it. That's the Boston that we know and that you'll expect actually to see from a rural point of view. So Boston's situated on the far east side of the county of Lincolnshire, near to the Wash, which is an estuary on the east side, which you'll all be aware of. It's a small market town and small port, and the population's around 39 to 41,000 within the town, but in the district area, in the wider rural community, it's around 65,000. And up to 25% of the community are from the migrant population, and they're made up of a mixture of Lithuanian, Latvian and Polish, with a smaller, more settled Portuguese community. They come mainly for employment in the agricultural side, but they come for looking for a better life, mostly from isolated communities in their own countries. And some bring families, many of them are young males who are coming to earn money to send back to their own countries. And they come for the better life, and sometimes when they get here, and often when they get here, it's not the promised land they thought of. So they come to gain full-time employment, they find themselves working part-time, living in houses of multi-occupancy, which are a significant issue, and they find themselves bored, drinking, depressed. That can lead to some crime. Not for everybody, but it does lead to crime, and it leads to violence, more importantly. What then happens, due to the demographics of the country and the involvement of the agencies, is actually the high-profile agencies who are visible in the town are the police and the borough council, and that's it, because actually mostly people are based at Lincoln and round about Lincoln, and so a lot of the community focus is centred on the police and the borough council, and it might not necessarily be our issue, but they're the ones that the community turns to for some answers, and we've got to be quite creative in how we manage that, how we remain neutral, and what our communication style is. So I'm not going to read all the slides, and I'm going to talk about a few areas. That's what Boston's famous for, same as any town, lots of little bits and pieces. Just taking you to the bottom bullet point, colleagues from Lithuania and Latvia tell us that in those countries, Boston's actually as high profile as London, and it's sometimes a bit of a choice as to where people decide to go. Very different places. Unfortunately, this is what Boston nationally is more famous for. Just pointing out for a few areas, the explosion where we had 5 deaths of Lithuanian and Latvian males was an illegal vodka distillery. The murder capital of UK, that was based on not the numbers, but it was based on the proportionality of attempt murders and murders versus the population. And again, as John's already mentioned, looking at the bottom bullet point, highest percentage of exit votes in the country. Just to touch on one thing which adds on to what we all know about policing is, in amongst all the challenges that I had, in 2013 there was some significant flooding where the river that runs through the town caused some significant risk to the community and flooded. And just my luck, the police station's right next to the river. So on top of that, we had to evacuate the police station and some real challenges. Okay, so what? Some of you might be thinking, well, that happens in my area. I've got massive BCU, happens every week. And it does, but the challenges for us in a small community where everybody knows everything is that every single issue, whether it's police related, whether it's national health related, is magnified, and it all adds up. And the community in general love Boston. They want it to be a nice place, and all they're seeing is a town that's in the news for the wrong reason, and actually the focus and the blame becomes towards the migrant population when that's not necessarily the case. And as we all know, Lincolnshire is also fairly high profile force for the financial challenges that we have. So there's not a lot of extra money and there's not a lot of extra resource. We are doing the right things to invest in protecting vulnerable people, but what does that mean for me as an area commander is that we're doing more with less. And in particular, when you're looking at some of the issues that we've got, that's a real challenge as well. And we haven't got to the sophisticated case of doing lots of things in partnership, because actually agencies in a transient population are struggling to keep up with who's there and what they need to do individually. Okay, so the force had to make some decisions, and at the time when this was starting to happen in 2012, when there was recognised some concerns, we'd moved to a theme structure. So what had happened with Boston, which was on the east side of the county, in a small town in one district, so it was a part of a number of towns in one district area. Boston was, the leader for Boston was an inspector, supported by a chief inspector who had more than one town, so he was the district chief inspector at that time. Superintendents who was responsible, there was four superintendents who were really responsible for policing in Boston: neighbourhoods, response, custody, and crime. So everyone was responsible, but no one was responsible. Not one person had a single point of contact other than the inspector. But the force recognised actually that the challenges for the inspector were too much for the inspecting rank, and recognised, as we all know, that actually there was a need for some real visibility and senior leadership from a superintendent rank. And that's where I come in. And I'm trying to keep the theme of space back to 2052 for Paul. And I kind of likened it to a bit of a Star Wars scene, my conversation with the chief. Not that I'm saying the chief is Darth Vader and breathes heavily, but he basically said to me, and I'd like to think I was a bit Luke Skywalker, Paula, you are the chosen one. Go forth to Boston and get operational grip. And that actually was my remit. That was my terms of reference. Go and sort it out. He didn't say come back when you finished. It was just go down there and sort it out. So I did. But the support that I got from the force was actually was good from a resourcing point of view. They allowed me to look at my workforce and through some of the selection and promotion processes, identify some, particularly at sergeant rank, because there were some significant issues with the consistency of sergeants down at Boston. And I was allowed to look at the talent, the pool talent that we had in the force, and actually select people who would make a difference, not just to making decisions and driving the business, but actually to be focused on the people as well, and give some support to the teams. Other important thing for me was to have a management team, a senior management team with the right attitude, and crucially for the last 4 years, we had 3 members of a very small management team of 5 for the east side of the county, who were consistent. And 2 of my chief inspectors throughout that time became temporary superintendents, but the consistency was really important, and we don't tend to get that long term in the police service, but that was a bit of a secret to our success. So I divided my challenges up into transformational and transactional issues. That's my task list, and I'm not going to go through it all, but it wasn't necessarily the what, because actually there's they're the tasks that we needed to do, and there'll be things that you recognise there. But what was important was the how we did it. And we invested a lot of time in thinking about how we're going to tackle these issues. And what was important for me was around taking a problem-solving approach all the time. So in anything that we thought about doing, we talked around communication, around understanding what the issue was and in which community it was, or what the issue was. And actually, more importantly, was about education our community. Just to give an example, was a social media website that was set up by a member of the community. I can't remember the exact name. It was something as simple as Boston Against Migration. But that became a huge focal point for the town. Lots of comments on, lots of worrying comments, and we knew we needed to do something about it. So we educated the guy who'd set it up and made sure he knew his responsibilities about policing this, because actually, we were bordering on some criminality in some of the comments that were made through naivety more than anything. So we took an approach of working with him. We worked with the social media websites and removed some of the really problem communications. We went to visit some of the people who we could identify. It's quite easy in a small town, and educated those. And if actually if there's anything serious, then we took more positive action. But we were actually, it was more around education and support and managing the tensions. And we couldn't afford to let this get out of control because we didn't have any additional resources to sort it out. And at the time, that was the right thing to do. But this did inflame the situation. The tension increased. The finger pointing towards the Borough Council and the police, essentially around what was a government issue. And the anger of the town was around the number of migrants coming into the town and the fact that migrants were coming in. And actually important for us that we, throughout this, remained neutral. We remained non-biased, but actually it was around making sure that we had those open and honest conversations. I've put houses and multi-occupancy in that list as well. Throughout the majority of our murders and attempt murders, they were linked to houses and multi-occupancy, and this is where people were drinking, falling out, and the violence was extreme and then ended up in a serious nature. And proportionately, Boston actually is, don't want to paint the wrong picture, it's a safe place to live. And it wasn't the number of crimes and the volume of the crimes, it was actually the seriousness when they were happening, which was the concern. So, again, looking at the people challenges. So this is a transformational side from me. The how bit was the same, so we did invest a lot of time on the how we did things. But we got in a position where actually despair was the right word for me to use. The community were frightened. They're saying we're not letting our children out, this is and it wasn't that kind of community, it was safe. I had school teachers getting the children to write to me and to the council to say how they were all frightened, and the university students. And it did at some points feel a little bit out of control. On top of that, it's not just about the community, it's actually about my workforce, and that was a really important factor as well. There's some officers who work very hard and still work very hard, and they're very skilled, particularly in dealing with crimes where actually they don't understand the spoken language of the incidents that they're going into. And as we all know, some incidents that the smaller incidents can become quite complex when there's language barriers. But Boston quickly became the punishment station, and I think maybe we all have stations where people don't want to go to. So not only have we got problems there, it's actually how the staff felt about the conversations externally around what was the perception of being at Boston, and there was some real pride in the work that they did, and rightly so, because the officers there were fantastic. But it's really important for myself to think about how we tackle that and what we do. And we put some really we spent a lot of time investing on actually how we communicate that to the force and really turn that into looking into opportunities rather than people being fearful. And again, in a rural force, the challenges for us were everybody lives in the city and gravitates around the city, and Boston's an hour drive. And actually there were some real challenges around recruitment and the work that we did in developing our own talent for promotion in that area, which has been really successful as well. Okay, so that's me getting a grip. It's leadership, it's basic leadership, and it's thinking about your personal style and how you're going to do that. And I think from my personal style, I am very people-focused, and I have swallowed the leadership pill a lot while I've been in my career for the last 30 years. But I decided and gave a lot of thought to how I was going to be, and for me it was around being present, being strong, being calm, and being involved. And there's nothing more powerful for me, whatever rank we are. When I was a superintendent there, when I became the chief superintendent, was actually going out there, being involved at the strategic level, but the staff were seeing what I was doing because it was in the press, because they were involved, and at times they had to be present at some of the public meetings because of the hostility. And they knew that we were there supporting them. And yes, when it was flooding, I was the last person off the police station watching the river flood, and I did get my feet wet. But actually seeing how the staff worked and the adversity and the challenges they were facing was really powerful for me, and that actually, helped me it just helped me to do my job, and it made me very passionate about actually the cause that we were trying to address. So an example for me really around one of the points in their listening and negotiating, The same guy again who set up the website around the protesting set up a meeting in the town and held it in assembly rooms, which I knew was quite a large room. I invited myself and the chief executive from the council, who we had a very good working relationship, and we had the conversation and said, yeah, we're going to go to this. Not to take over, but to actually sit in the back, but be present, but actually to show the community that we were interested as well. When we got there, standing room only, people from all over the place, and the organiser was clearly out of his depth. He'd even moved our chairs onto the stage so we could take over the meeting. So we did. We listened to the community, we managed the language, we took some time to educate people and actually push back at what they were saying and ask them to listen to themselves. It was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek moment because it could go either way, but actually that worked really well. And it worked well in that community. I'm not going to say it works well in all, but it actually went some way to actually making our community think about the language they were using and what they were saying. And that again developed the relationships that we had with those people and gave us the opportunity to wear that. It was very high profile, it's televised locally. And again, for me, in every communication, it was around what we're saying, how we're saying, does this sound neutral, and is this achieving what we need to do about keeping the tension proportionate, because it was not as bad as the community perceptions. One area that I'll just pick up there, which was very successful for us, was our USEC team. It's a bullet point in the middle. We decided there was no, at that time, no force appetite. The issue was actually local. But the team that we said, and I'm talking team, and it's a Lincolnshire-sized team, so I'm talking a couple of intelligence officers and some officers within the neighbourhood policing team. And we even thought long and hard about what we were going to call this team, because actually we wanted to send a strong message to the community that we were looking at the whole community and we were safeguarding everybody. And that was really important, because that was really what we needed to do. So from the intelligence side, we focused the intelligence team on really getting into the detail of who was in the town, where the town was made up of, what else we could find out. From the neighbourhood side, it was around understanding where all the communities were. There's no natural leaders or groups forming within some of the Eastern and Central European community, and they were spread around the town. So we really needed to do some detailed work there. And the focus that we directed the neighbourhood policing team on wasn't about integration, it was about acceptance. For me, Boston wasn't in the place where it was going to suddenly go from nothing to integration. There had to be some acceptance and understanding, and that was the brief for the officers and for our managers, which is what they did, and did that very well. Partnership role, really important. There had been I think for some of you who work across in the Northwest, there's a company who were called the Centre of Good Relations had come to Boston before I got there. And unfortunately, the police hadn't engaged. They didn't see their role in that opportunity. So I did a bit of catch up with them. But more importantly for me was the role of the county council and the councillors. And they decided to set up a task and finish group where they held all agencies to account. That held ourselves to account, they held National Health Service, the job centre, university, and anywhere which could have been impacted with the migrant community, the farming environment, to ask them a set of questions to help them and the community understand the impact of migration. And at the conclusion of this, they did a really a good report, which was really good from a myth-busting point of view. And it identified to the community that it wasn't all linked to migration. There were some issues, certainly with the Indigenous population, and actually the migrant community weren't all the ones who were obtaining job seekers allowance, which was another myth in the town. And we had to remember actually that our community, a large section of our community wanted to be involved with the migrant community because there is diversity in the town, and the farmers and the gangmasters certainly wanted them to come from the employment side, because they couldn't employ some of the local community who just didn't want that work. So my role and my reflection on my role, I've had the opportunity I've been posted to the west side of the county in the same role now, so I've had an opportunity to take a step back and have a look at how it felt, and how I would describe my experiences. It's like a bottle of fizzy pop with a loose top. And every incident, big or small, an RTC, the community saying who's involved, what's the nationality, and we have to manage that all the time. But every time that there's an incident, it's like a little shake of the bottle or a big shake of the bottle. And our job really was to just sit on top of that lid and not let the lid come off, because it didn't need to, because actually, the community were more concerned about the issues than they should have been. And we did achieve that. The need for detail for us to go into some of the detail that you'd never expect to go in was unusual, but that's the way that we chose to do it, which was successful. We dealt with the strategic issues, and that allowed our managers to go and do their jobs, because in between that there's other crime issues, other things happening, and that worked very well. We did make a difference. Some of the areas that we addressed, we came very good, and we've got some really positive feedback around how we managed our repatriation processes. And it wasn't about getting people out of town, but there were people who moved into the town who couldn't afford to go home and they wanted to go back. So we've been working with agencies to do that. And we've looked at the other opportunities through administration for people who aren't exercising their treaty rights. If they're coming to the town and they're not exercising their treaty rights, should they be staying in the town? They're the conversations to be had. Not fully our responsibility, but we are the ones who start to understand that. And again, looking at some of the criminality, and if they are criminals, do they fit the criteria for deportation? But just to put some proportionality back on there, there's some really good people who've come from those countries who are bringing a different vibrance into the town, and we need to make sure that the town continues with that. So success is only as good as that moment in time, and what happens, and concerns still continue at Boston. And there has been some more murders within the migrant community, and they're being managed very well. Expectations of Brexit will be an interesting one for the community, and in the town again, we'll have a community tension assessment when the government starts to announce what the plans are, because actually there are maybe some expectations from the community that might not happen. For me, and I'm nearly finished, sorry Gary, I've run a little bit over, is the things that I would like to see to support us in policing is to better intelligence check through border control. No doubt about that is looking at some of the documentation. We know there's a disproportionate amount of passports versus people who come from those communities, and we have got some problems with passports, and there's opportunities at a central point within the country actually to manage what's coming in the country to allow us to then manage those communities. I need to look at a workforce, or I want some more support to look at a workforce that reflects our community, but that is challenging given some of the financial challenges for the force and some longer term cohesion requirements. So just to conclude, that's kind of me hiding behind the tree at times. Every phone call is what's going to happen next. And I did feel like hiding behind the tree, but I didn't. And it was the right thing to do to stand up. Some of the jobs probably weren't mine, but nobody else was going to do it, and it was really important that we could keep a lid on that. And it's really, I've really identified the impact on me as an operational leader, having been at Lincoln, when exactly the same things are happening, but they're absorbed into the city environment. And the first time there was a murder within a migrant community, I was braced, ready for action, and nobody blinked an eyelid. And that was a pretty surreal moment for me. So I think that was just shortly before Paul asked me to do the presentation, and Nowhere to Hide was the first thing that came into mind for me, is that you have to stand up and be counted, particularly in the rural areas, because everybody's looking at you. So that's it from me, and I'll just hand over to Gary.
Thank you. For those of you who sharp-eyed, you'll have seen on the slide that came up, it said Jenny Barnett was the person that was going to give this presentation. I actually plotted up Jenny for this because, unlike me, who is 29 years service, white male, Jenny's a direct entry superintendent, posted to Newham, and she's from an African Caribbean background, and her perspective on this discussion was going to be different than mine. However, when I got a phone call from Paul a couple of days ago saying that very, very good reasons. Jenny couldn't be here. I had to do the right thing and stand up. So this is a personal reflection of being a Met Superintendent Operational Leader. It's not about being us in the Met, because sometimes in the Met it feels a bit like being the Millwall of policing. You all hate us and we don't care. It is something that the perception of the counties about the way the Met operates is sometimes, and it could have perceived that I'm coming up here to big up the Met. It's not. These challenges could have happened anywhere across the country. It just so happens that this is my experience of working within the Met. Some of the things are the key leadership challenges. I try to get some commonality between myself and Jenny, and the one thing that is common is we both operated as superintendents at Newham. And Newham is a place which I'll go on to, which is very diverse and very complex and has a number of communities. What are the risks, not only personal risks, what are the risks to the organisation of getting it wrong, and what is the learning, and what else can we do different? And this is where I've left a couple of Jenny's slides in this, because we both share this same passion about how we need to police communities in the future. Newham, I'm not sure how many people of you before the 2012 Olympics would have known where Newham was. In the 60s, the rationalisation of the boroughs in London, they put East Ham and West Ham together, and they came up with the very creative name of Newham. For those of you that know Newham, most people that live in Newham do not consider themselves to be residents of Newham. They consider themselves to be part of the component parts. And you may well have heard of those component parts: the East Hams, the West Hams, the Stratfords, Canning Town, Manor Park, etc. The reason I put a mythical place is, for those of you who've done your Osprey exams, there is this place called Sandford. It's got everything in it. Newham has everything in it. If you look at the top left-hand corner, I've got the West Ham sign. Very tribal football ground. Used to be in the Bowlin down in East Ham. Gone back now to their spiritual home in Stratford. They've taken over the Olympic Park. You have the Olympic Park itself, a national stadium with international events. You've got the World Athletics Championships coming up there. Bottom left-hand corner, you've got the Excel Centre, which is the largest exhibition centre in Europe, and hosts everything from G20 to SCI and a number of other things. And then you've got the London City Airport, and of those who saw the news yesterday, sometimes things can go a bit wrong. It's an international airport, and those things that go on there. Also around Newham, you've got the complexity of the actual place. It sits in the east of London. The majority of London is moving east. And as I'll go into a bit of explanation as to the complexities of the communities. But that is Newham and where it is. Okay, when you Google most diverse place in London, or even in the UK, you get the different metrics and you do get the different understandings. Hillingdon is considered the most diverse place by language. Harrow is considered the most diverse place by religion. Newham is considered to be the most diverse place by population. Newham comes second on both of those other two indexes as well. Going into the details there, it doesn't give the true picture. If you look at the residents who are, the actual fourth largest population 3-4 years ago was French in Newham. It's a transient population, it changes all the time. But one of the most interesting statistics that I heard most recently about Newham is it is 91% non-British born. Just reflect on that. That kind of complexity, 190 languages, all the other complexity that go with it, but 91% non-British born. The population's between 270 and 320,000 because they don't really know, because of and I'll explain later about some of the issues, which are very similar to Boston, but on a much larger scale down in Newham. Things that have happened in Newham are significant. Lots and lots of things have happened. I put these top two because it is a tragedy, and I have a relationship with both these. Nina Mackay is the top left. Nina was murdered going into a flat to execute a warrant as part of the TSG. Very sadly, took her Met vest off in order to facilitate using the enforcer. First through a door, tragically stabbed on the way through. There is a Nina Mackay Way in Newham, which is significant because of the way the community are engaged with the police. The next one is Gary Toms. Gary was an SCO 19 firearms officer involved in a pursuit. Deployed a tactic at the time called cracking the door. So the door was open so he could access the vehicle quickly. The vehicle continued the pursuit, reversed. He came out of the vehicle and fell over and smashed his head and died tragically. I was at Newham at the time when that happened. The bottom left, and this is an interesting one. I've tried to get the most sensitive picture. It's Lansdowne Road in Newham, which is in Forest Gate. the two brothers that were involved in the terrorism incidents, one of them was shot by police. And that started ongoing issues with the relationship between Newham, Prevent and CT. And the one on the right I'll go to in a minute, but when I was at Newham, I was in my first meeting there, and there was a wag from the security services that said, the only place in the world with less terrorists than Newham is the Swat Valley in Afghanistan. And that's the way the attitude was at the time as we went forward. Very challenging to try and introduce what was a very new instrument, but the Prevent was the issue. Real manifestation. On the right there is Rashara Chowdhury. She stabbed Stephen Timms in his constituency office. He survived, but she was self-radicalised off the internet, and a very, very dangerous lady, and her sister equally so. Contrast in Newham, top left-hand corner, you've got the Westfield Centre. In the bottom right is the Stratford Mile. Masses of money and investment. Literally, you walk down the escalator and you go into the Mile at McDonald's. That was the crime hotspot for Newham at the time. If you go into the south of the borough, you've got the Excel Centre with the Docklands. Just over the other side of the tracks, you've got the Custom House, etc. Massive poverty. The leadership approach of Newham, very complex. It's in the top 3 of everything in the Met. It's not one of the Super 6 as we consider them. It's not very well known, but it is one of the riskiest boroughs in London around volume, crime, risk crime, youth violence, highest level of domestic violence at times, youth violence, etc. Leadership approach to it. I was a PC at Tottenham in the 90s. Now, everybody associates Tottenham with a very negative image of policing, but Tottenham was very, very good at policing. If you were a PC at the time, if you looked across the border at Craven Park Road down into Hackney in the 90s, the relationship between the community and the police in Hackney at the time, end of the 80s and 90s, was very different to that experience in Tottenham. And what it taught me was to engage with communities, even as a PC, a very junior PC, you actually got far more done and you worked more effectively. I had the privilege of going back to Chief Inspector at Haringey and learnt exactly the same things and worked with the same people I worked with as a PC, but at a more strategic level, and the same people were doing the same very, very good jobs. The difference between Haringey and Newham is the legacy of Haringey and the issues that can bubble at any particular time. Newham didn't have that legacy. We all considered ourselves to have a siege mentality, and I'll come back to that later on when you consider how you operate in policing terms in that kind of complexity. The other thing to know is to know your communities. One of the challenges with Newham is, and as you say, 91% non-British born, is how do you know what your communities are or who they are? And it changes on almost a daily basis where something pops up. When the Olympics was put into Newham, which was a fantastic thing and an amazing opportunity for development, and the benefits are still reeling in. But one of the disbenefits of that was, in the back of Green Street, where there's all the Victorian houses, they started to build shanty towns at the back. And they started to house Eastern European migrants and workers. When I say house, that's the loosest sense of the terms. It was a shanty town. And there's I couldn't get hold of the photograph, unfortunately, but there's a picture of one of the houses, and it says number A and B, and then it says C, D, E, F, G, H, J. And what they'd done is they'd basically got some electricity, thrown a cable over the top, and then put people in the back. There were 32 people living in what was tantamount to a garage. Now, one of the challenges for policing perspective from that is all those people were on shifts sleeping in the beds. So when they weren't in the beds, they were hanging around in the area. They didn't know the area, they didn't have an association or affiliation. So that brought a lot of increase in antisocial behaviour, threat levels, and also violence. The next step on that is know your staff, and I think probably there's a couple of them still that did that journey with me. I know Kev's here, who's now in Essex. Know your staff, but know your teams and understand the way they operate. The siege mentality in Tottenham was quite a positive thing because we all worked together as a loyalty. In Hackney, it was a negative thing because they all worked together against the community in some respects. Now, that's disrespect to Hackney then, not now. So you have to be very careful that your teams are operating in a way where they're working with communities. And most of the time, that was very positive. Know your partnership and obviously be very, very careful of your personal resilience and make yourself going. I wanted to use an example of youth violence as how quickly things can change. Newham was never considered to be a very high gang area prior to the murder of Stephen. Now, this could be replicated anywhere in the country. Unfortunately, the gravity and the severity was magnified because of the urban environment in which it operated. Stephen was a looked-after child. Up to the age of 11, very bright, very good in his CAT scores, very good in his SAT scores, lived with his grandmother because he had a chaotic parenting. His mother was a poly-drugs user, his dad was an alcoholic. He was up in Blackpool in semi-secure accommodation. He left there to come back to London to sort an issue. There are a number of operational and organisational failings in this that have been looked at and reflected on and learned from. The comment is not made any kind of agency or otherwise. Stephen was reported missing by a PC. Sadly, that PC on his way back to the station to put him on the PNC was delayed through an RTA for no reason of his own. Therefore, Stephen arrives in London not shown as missing. He's seen by a PCSO who knows him and does a name check on him, not shown as missing. Stephen then goes to the party. It's a peace party. It's a knife crime peace party, a third sector party, and he arrives there to sort out some respect. His father gets wind of it, and his sister gets wind of the fact that he's come down to London. They're very scared for him. His dad is an alcoholic. He's been drinking. He phones up Scotland Yard, he phones the 999 system, and he tells Scotland Yard that his son is going to be killed, and he gives them an address. Unfortunately, it's the wrong address. So police are chasing down there to try and save this young man's life. At the same time, it's all kicking off at the peace party. A load of cops arrive at one end. The party kicks out at the other end, and Stephen gets stabbed. There are 72 witnesses. As with everything, nobody gets seen much. As it builds up, Stephen affiliated with a number of different peer groups within Newham. He did not operate as a gang. He was not on our gangs matrix. After he died, his mother, he lived in Chad Green, his mother decided that it would be a very good idea to use everybody turn up in his favourite colour, which was green. 400 people turned up in green. The affiliated peers came together and the Green Gang was formed. Now, at the bottom there, at that time in London, there was an enormous, I think we had 22 youth murders the year before. Stephen was the first one that was murdered that year. We had another one 2 weeks later. And then suddenly, we had a build-up of stabbings every day and threats and tension, etc., etc. And it became very, very challenging for us. All the other issues that were going on in Newham, and we had to consider some of our options. And this is where it goes round to reflecting on Matthew Syed. One of those options available to us was Section 60, as we've all used. Now, in Newham, we imposed Section 60. I don't know exactly how long, but it was basically every day for 2 years. For a number of reasons. And the main reason was we felt that that was going to help save kids' lives because it gave us an opportunity to get amongst them and release the tension. Was it proportionate? Of course it wasn't. Was it the right thing to do? Probably not. Did we just sign them willy-nilly? Yes, we did. But we did that for the right reasons. In hindsight, when you look back, it was probably wrong. And when you look at the statistics and the reviews and everything going on, Newham is a very key area within that. But it was a challenge we put forward, and that's why we did it. Is London representative? Are we representative of London? When you look at the figures here around, and this is the point I wanted to go into that was Jenny's slide as well. One of the things we found out when we were fighting the cause, and I'll come into that in a bit later, around trying to tackle and suppress youth violence, along with all the other burglaries, robberies and motor vehicles that were going on, we did not necessarily have a representative police force in Newham. However, with 91% non-British born and 191 languages, how do you represent? And this gives you a breakdown of what London looks like. How do we actually recreate that? And one of the Commissioner's aims was to increase the ethnicity of London by having a selection process where you had to live or have resided in London for 3 of the previous 6 years to try and make you have more of a feeling and understanding it. This is one of Jenny's slides that she put in as we go across the ethnicity by rank. Because when Jenny arrived in the service, the direct entry system was about looking and making people feel different and looking and reflecting, bringing new ideas into London. Most of them come to London initially, but into bringing into policing. And these are some of the issues But bring it back to my context, because I'm conscious of the time. What is a Londoner? I live in London. I live in Waltham Forest, which is the borough just north of Newham. Am I a Londoner? No, I grew up in rural Cambridgeshire. Is a newly arrived migrant and the transient population that goes in and out of all these shanty towns in Newham, which have been cleared up significantly, I must say, etc. Or is it somebody that's in the last the last 6 years? So I can go to university in London for 3 years and I can become a Londoner. I don't think so. You've got to live, and there are people in London that understand context of London, which is why it's the best way to police. Growing promoter, these statistics are quite shocking when you look at them, bearing in mind the numbers of officers around the country, and I'm going to get onto that point in a minute. Okay, this is the point I want to... When we tackled the youth violence in Newham, this is a meeting immediately after the second death, and it's building bridge builders in Unity, and the 3 officers there are, on the left-hand side is the ward officer, on the right-hand side is Bob, who was my youth strategist at the time, just brought him in to do it, and in the middle is me. And you're probably thinking here, why are those people sitting inside with their hats on, etc. The reason we're sitting with our hats on is because it very, very nearly kicked off. There is 150 people in that room, and we put our hats on to try and make us look a little bit more, because as you can see, we're not wearing our PPE or anything, to look a little more like in control. Now, one of the significant things about that is I immediately took control because I was the senior officer and I wanted to make them listen to me. And I would make them listen. And then Bob stood up. Now, Bob was born in East Ham, which is in Newham, and I observed the way that Bob interacted with, and there were 4 white people in that room. Myself, my sergeant, and 2 others who happened to be from Unity Bridge Builders. And I observed the way Bob worked that room, how they respected him, and how we ended up in a position where they would listen to us. And in that meeting, I'm trying to convince them. I'm even there then. I thought, why am I sitting in the middle leading this? Bob should be leading this. And Bob did. And for the next 2 years, I went to every meeting and Bob sat in the middle and they listened to Bob. It didn't matter where we went, they actually listened, because he stood up and he said, I was born in East London and you are, these are the opportunities available to you if you choose whatever path it was. Now, the reason I'm saying this is for 2 reasons. Bob is a superb cop. He's very operationally sound. The route strategy he did and the work he did in Newham was phenomenal. He saved lives by the way he integrated policing, communities together, and actually making a difference. And it was a brilliant, brilliant strategy, and it worked. And however, Bob is an inspector now. Bob has failed the promotion process 3 times. It doesn't seem to matter. I mean, he's articulate. He's good at boards, he gets prepped, etc. But for whatever reason, there is some reason somewhere that stops Bob becoming promoted. And that's, when you go back to the previous slide, is one of the challenges we have as an organisation going forward. It doesn't matter where you are in the country, you have to police the community by consent. Therefore, you have to reflect the community. In London, that is a diverse and complex community. But having somebody there as a role model is very, very important, because then that people can aspire to that. There is another borough in London, Ealing, which has got a chief superintendent, Paul Martin, you won't mind me saying. People flock from a BME community, policing-wise, flock to work within Paul's borough. And it's palpable, you can see that. The reason is because he's a very strong, visible leader, and they see an aspiration that they can be like him. How do we make the Bobs and the Pauls of this world far more in there? That's the challenge we've got going forward, to be more representative. In Gavin's speech yesterday, he said the same thing. At our ranks, how do we get them in? We need to get more Bobs. It's not because Bob isn't good. Bob's good. But for some reason, he's failing a process consistently. And if everybody's good, I mean, there are people in this room that have failed processes that are good, and we all know that. But why? We need to get it better, because we need to do something to make sure there's more Bobs in this world, so we can control more young people to stop them going off and down the wrong tracks. Things flashing, which is quite disturbing. The reason I put this up is, I had this, the chap in the minute is Sir Robin Wales. He is the Mayor of Newham. I say that deliberately because he says, I am the Mayor of Newham, not the London Borough of Newham, because he represents people. We didn't always agree. Some of his policies were way offline. But one thing you can always think, he had the people of community of Newham absolutely at the heart of everything he did. And the social capital he put into Newham was phenomenal. And he worked very closely with us, and we had exactly the same ideas. The one on the left, this is the right one is my photograph, the left-hand one is Jenny's, just to say this is the way forward. We've got to engage better with communities. And again, I've gone over time by 18 seconds. Personal reflection is two things. Firstly, when I left Newham, the bar was up here. So I went to Barking first and then Camden. When somebody got a nick on their hand and the local authority wanted to do an incident note, I was going, what, really? And that I didn't realise that everything had to be up here. And that's a very, very dangerous place to be. A very dangerous place to be. And the second thing is, I didn't realise how busy I was and how I was worrying about my resilience until I stepped away from it and looked back. And at the time, the team were absolutely fantastic. That would not have happened without a team here, and some of them are here today. That's the way forward, and that was the leadership challenges. That was a whistle-stop tour. Hopefully I wasn't too Millwall met, but it's just to give you an idea of the differences between policing complex communities in London and those in Lincolnshire. So thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Give them both a round of applause, then. The floor is yours. Anyone want to ask a question or make a comment, please attract. We've got a gentleman at the back down there. Kick it off if you will. Can we get a microphone to... While we're doing that, it seemed to me you reflect two different sort of issues in a way. I mean, the tension in and around Boston was tension between one community and another community. The tension from my experience, and I remember I was at the Brixton riots, and not in some respects there's still tension, isn't there? Yeah. But that's tension between a community and the police in the main in London, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. What is the relationship now between you and or people, the police force in Lincolnshire, and the Polish, Romanian, Lithuanian community? Do they see you as on their side? Do they see you in the main? Do they see you as the enemy?
It's quite an interesting. Can you hear me? It's quite an interesting one, because actually a lot of the tension was the indigenous population who lived there, and actually the Central and Eastern European communities were stepped back a lot from that. There were some who were quite vocal about it, but they didn't respond with the same kind of tension. We knew that we needed to break some barriers down, because of course there's a very different policing culture in their countries, and they arrive in our towns with a concern around the police, around how they're going to be dealt, will it be through enforcement, and actually there are examples that we've seen through some of the evidence that there is corruption in some of the other forces. So we've improved that through our communications, through the involvement, and actually, you know, from many of them having some involvement with us, but also identifying not community leaders, because they don't have community leaders as such, but we've identified people who are prepared within those communities to talk to us and advise us, and there's still a lot of work to do. And we've actually put a dedicated liaison officer in with a pure role of actually breaking down those barriers. Is
there, it's a question, I don't know the answer, you may have touched on this, if you did I missed it, so forgive me. Is there a disproportionate level of crime within those Lithuanian, Romanian communities as opposed to the indigenous community?
Yeah, if you divide it up by some of the areas, you know, for example, with the murders, you know, there was a disproportionate number of murders from the migrant community, but then you have to actually break it down to the different migrant communities as well. But there was some involvement there. So yes, there is, but it's not as disproportionate as some of the perceptions within the community, where actually all the crime is committed by the migrant community, because that's just not right. But yes, the disproportionality is when you think about the population being 25%, if that's fully accurate, because it's a while since there's been a full census and we have a transient community, it is disproportionately higher. And
to ask you a question, Gary, if I may, I mean, at the Brixton riots in 1981, in my personal opinion, the behaviour of a tiny minority of police officers was shameful, disgraceful. Things have come on a lot, I accept that. But there is still tension. It's partly caused by SUS, and I know the Home Secretary's done a fair bit to change that. How do you account for the hostility that still, within certain communities, still exists between you, the police force, and them?
I think we police London by consent, and we do tend to get it wrong. And if we get it wrong spectacularly, because you know, one bad story spreads a lot quicker than 1,000 good stories. we need to engage better and understand better the way the community expectations of policing, but also how we don't impose policing on them, we work with them. And we've moved, I mean, 81 is, I mean, we have gone quantum leaps ahead. And even the most recent riots in 2011, there were other issues that were mainly driving those riots than it was around the relationships with police in Tottenham. And I'll go back to saying the way Tottenham is policed is very effective. It goes back to legacies. There's a lot of legacies, and it's about the community moving forward. And one of the bonuses about somewhere like Newham, which is so transient, so different, they all get on very, very well as a community. There is very little community tension amongst them. There's territorialism amongst the indigenous population, but therefore the relationship with the police is just consistent across the board. There is no one community that clashes with the police, whereas in other areas there are in London, and Lambeth is one of those, and Southwark as well, but also in Hackney and Tottenham. So yes, we just got to keep engaging and understand.
Yeah, but I mean, I can see on paper and in theory that recruiting more BME people into the force is a good thing, and it's puzzling, to put it mildly, that 28% apply and only 17% get jobs. But is recruitment of more people from those communities it's not the only answer, is it?
It's not the only. I mean, there is no silver bullet for this, but I mean, it was shocking at the speed at which somebody that they related to and respected, as in Bob, could calm them down, and actually they would listen to him. And whether it was a cultural thing or otherwise, but it was. I mean, I just tried my approach to doing it, and Bob did his approach. But Bob's visible approach was.
Well, it begs the next question: why is it Bob? And you are obviously puzzled as to why Bob has not made more progress. And you know, people outside the general community are very puzzled as to why there are, I think, 3, maybe 4 police forces in the UK that don't have one single black person working for them. People from those communities don't tend to get jobs above the rank of chief superintendent, and it just begs the question: is there institutional racism within the police force and the higher echelons of the police force?
I don't think. I mean, there's unconscious bias, which is totally different from institutional police racism. There are barriers that are being put in place, whether they're visible or otherwise, that are preventing us promoting people into.
What are those barriers?
It's our systems. We don't actually know. If we had the golden bullet to say, yeah, this is exactly what is wrong with it, but we know there's something wrong because we're not getting the right people through, or we're not getting enough proportionality through. And this isn't just from the BME community. This is females and LGBT as well. And in fact, the hidden agenda in there is LGBT because it's a non-visible protected characteristic.
Do you share that opinion? We'll go to our guy at the back. Sorry. About the barriers and the difficulties, and would it, in your view, make the difference that Gary thinks it would make?
I think challenges for us are very different, actually, because we're not looking at visibility. Actually, for us, the need in Boston is around white European, but it's around the spoken language. So there are barriers, and I think from our point of view it would be very different. But the barriers to recruitment for us are more around some of the rules about how long you've lived in the country, some of the academic achievements that you need to enter the police service, but also from some of our Eastern Central European community is actually the written application. And as much as we've actually tried to encourage people to apply, to come into the organisation, the written applications are just not getting through the process. So there's some challenges, but longer term integration, I'm hopeful, will change that.
Our friend at the back, tell us who you are, sir, and make your point.
Yeah, thank you. Mark Thornton from Cleveland and Durham. And it's important that distinction in my job description to my question, I think. We've heard this week quite a lot about the British policing model with 43 forces, maybe it's not being fit for purpose for threat, harm and risk, and how we're structured for going forward. The question is, do you think our communities, mixed or otherwise, are bothered about the cap badge, or do they just want the police to turn up when they need them?
Can you explain that question to me? I'm sorry, I don't quite follow that. That's my ignorance. Not when you distinction between
our communities, we possibly think reference to our forces, the cap badge, the identity of the local police officer. But actually they only really call upon us when they're needed, and is it actually the badge of police that's important to help us restructure ourselves?
All right, fair enough, okay. Paula?
Okay. I mean, we have the experience in Lincolnshire where we're in a 3, 4, 5 force collaboration in various areas. So we get a lot of support through our regional colleagues, through roads policing and through major crime. What's more important is maybe not necessarily the CAP badge, but I think there is opportunities in neighbourhood policing to provide that consistency with the communities. Because they want to be treated the same by the same people and they want that involvement. So there's positives and negatives for having that mix, as long as actually within the different cultures that there's appreciation of the different dynamics of the different makeups of the town. So if an officer's coming from Nottinghamshire, for me, I'd be hopeful that they would adapt maybe their personal style or their attitudes to come and deal with things differently. And as we know, it's not that different actually, dealing with the same challenges. So I think my point would be that there's a strong argument for locality. I don't think the CAP badge itself is necessary. It's just making sure that whoever comes across and whoever's involved is consistent in their style and attitudes.
Just come back to you if I may. Remind me of your name, sir, again, sorry.
Mark?
Mark. Is Middlesbrough in Cleveland?
Yes.
Yeah. The reason I asked that question is, there is some disquiet in communities like Middlesbrough, as I understand it, like Rochdale, for example, about the way in which migrants are dispersed, and they say dumped on towns like Rochdale, towns like Middlesbrough. Is that? I mean, it's getting a bit political, this, but is that a sort of sentiment you share?
I think ultimately the communities call upon the police when they have a need. And many of the times, the service that we can offer is only at point of crisis. So therefore, the communities are made of individuals, and whatever their background, nationality, ethnicity, language, isn't really an issue to them as individuals when they have a problem.
And the fact there are big numbers of them there is not a root cause of the problem, and that's the point I'm making. That if they are sent there in large numbers, that immediately, not immediately, but in certain circumstances, creates a tension that wouldn't otherwise be there.
No, you've heard earlier there about sort of the indigenous population or otherwise. I think all communities are transient, and we've got to adapt to that transient nature going forward.
Gentleman over here somewhere? Yes.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Trevor Rowe, Essex Police. I'm one of the commanders at Harlow. We're right in the middle of a murder 10 days ago within the Polish community, where the victim was attacked by a group of youths. We've had then a vigil march on Saturday this weekend, just gone, and again some minor skirmishes around public order that then resulted in the early hours of Sunday morning with a serious assault on 2 further Polish individuals. The Polish Foreign Minister is engaged with our Foreign Secretary. We've had the Ambassador in Harlow at least twice. And only yesterday we have had the head of the Polish police arrive in Harlow, and now Polish officers will be working alongside our staff for the next week. My question is, throughout this week and the last 10 days, the IAG, we've tried to engage, but we've found that it's not been representative of our community, and that's something that we need to try and fix. Thank you for your presentations, but I haven't heard anything around sort of your local IAGs. I'd be very interested to see whether that made a difference.
Help me out, what does that mean?
Independence advisory groups, which are the community representatives.
All right. Gary, do you want to come in on that?
I mean, it was 20 minutes. You could spend 5 hours talking about some of the other challenges around partnerships and communities. IAGs are absolutely brilliant if they're representative. If you get the same people from the communities that have always come along not representing the people, then you've got no hope. But if they are they actually visibly are, and community-based, understand the issues for both policing and for the communities, absolutely you can't. And you need to make sure they're representative. You need to have, and almost different types of IAG to draw upon. If you need to have those Polish-speaking and understand the context and culture of Poland, because otherwise, you can't engage, because we don't understand all the different plethoras of languages, etc. So yes, I could have gone into some of the challenges around working with IAGs and some of the massive benefits that we've got from engaging with those. So yeah, I mean, it's a given for us, definitely.
One final point, because we've got to wind up, unfortunately. I found this debate fascinating. I find all your debates fascinating, but this is particularly so. post-Brexit, you touched on Brexit and the possible ramifications of that. I mean, nationally, there's no doubt about it that we've seen a spike in so-called hate crimes. Has that happened in Boston? Has that happened in Lincolnshire generally?
Not significantly from a hate crime point of view, and I have to say, if there is any indications around a hate crime, then as everybody will be, we're all over it. But I haven't seen a significant increase, and I'm just thinking about the Boston. But I couldn't really comment on the rest of the force. I've not had a really wider opportunity to have a look at that. Yeah.
Anybody else want to come in? We're going to wind this up. Okay. Oh, we got one more very quickly, if you don't mind, sir, because I'm overrunning. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Sean Wilson from the Met. Message, question to Paula, please, regarding houses of multiple occupancy. Oh, yeah. In London, they're increasing in number. There's a perceived value by the building companies for the volume of people they provide to the sites. I can see that would be the same perception out where yourself to the agricultural community, but actually we find they're fueling criminality as well. So my question to yourselves is, how have you tackled the HMOs and what lessons did you learn?
You may have been the author of a question I've got on my app, but thank you very much indeed. I'd missed it. I come from a town called Oldham where, when I was a kid, the Asian mill workers used to multi-occupy houses as well. The night shift would sleep during the day shift would sleep during the night. 20, 30 people in, well, allegedly anyway, in comparatively small houses. There wasn't this issue that there is now. How big a problem is it? Well, you've heard about, we know about London. Ealing is another area where this happens, isn't it? Yeah. Does it spurn crime?
I was wondering if I should answer
sorry, Paul, it was for you. I'm sorry. Yeah.
It's a real challenge due to the licence and restrictions that we've actually imposed and or that are actually that allow us to manage. What we did with the local authority was we've had some joint operations and identified actually some of the HMOs where just from looking at the roadside we think there's some challenges. It's identifying who the landlords are and trying to work with the landlords to make sure actually they're following the fire regulations, everything that they should be following, so actually we can manage in a different way the working environments. But I don't think we've quite got to the final point of actually being able to control them. And I think that for myself and the conversation with the council there, we would want further looking forward, further controls and restrictions around HMOs because they are a significant issue and there's not some legislation that can help us remove the problems and challenges we've got.
Quick word, Gary, then I'm going to run up.
In answer to your question, does it fuel crime? Sometimes, yes. Where you have a large, mainly young male population who can't go to bed because somebody else is sleeping in their bed and they've got to occupy themselves, and they have a tendency to want to drink, then that fuels violence.
We'd like to thank them both very much indeed for their contribution. That was fascinating. Great.